Children's Community of Practice webinar. Now, we've had some really great talks today showcasing different people's work and their learnings from doing PPI in statistical settings. So we've got more of that to come today. And today, specifically, we're joined by Professor Christina Yap from the Institute of Cancer Research in London. So Christina is a chartered statistician and she's got over 20 years experience, and that's in both trial methodology and in the conduct of applied trials. So she is motivated by a desire to ensure that trials are utilised to their best potential to influence clinical practice. And her research focuses on developing and translating innovative methods into real practice. And this is ultimately to enable more effective trial delivery and to ultimately improve benefits for patients. So this touches on early phase and adaptive trial as her work. And so today, Christina is going to be talking to us about impactful PPIE in early phase trials, from driving innovation in guideline and trial design development. So Christina's got about 35 to 40-minute talk, and then there'll be some time for Q&A at the end. So if you do have any questions, do jot those down and we'll take them after that. Okay, so without any further ado, I'll hand over to Christina.
Thank you so much, Susie. I'm just going to try to share my slides.
Great.
Are you able to see my slides?
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Susie. Thanks for the kind introduction. And thank you so much for joining us today. And very much honored and delighted to give this talk. So I'll be focusing on impactful patient and public involvement engagement in early phase trials, drawing for two main research areas that have been involving patient partners, particularly one in guideline development as well as trial design development. So this is the outline of my talk. I'll be touching on, first of all, just a background of PPIE in early phase methods research. So here I'm focusing more on developing new methods, new statistical methods. For example, that I'll mention later about guidelines as well as designed pro-integrated trial designs. I'll touch on my brief overview of my journey involving patients in this area. And then in my talk, I'll touch on these two areas. So one is the spirit and consult extension for dose-finding trials. And the second part is about integrating PROs, patient-reported outcomes, in phase 1 dose-finding trials, and how we developed new pro-integrated trial designs in the setting. And I'll end off with some summary and takeaway. Okay, so PPIE in early phase methods research. So involving patients and the public has greatly improved in clinical trials. So when we design clinical trials, we've been involving more and more patients in our trial designs as well as conduct and reporting. And that has really enhanced its quality, relevance, and efficiency. However, patient and public involvement engagement is still actually very much emerging in early phase clinical trials, particularly in phase 1 trials. So that's not so that's increasing, but actually it's not a common space whereby patients actually be included in actually the design of very early phase trials. Impactful involvement in methods research in phase 1 is even rarer. However, it is essential. As you can see, some of the references that talk about methods research in later phase trials, and all the key points that I've mentioned in later phase trials is very much applicable in early phase as well. So research initiatives like the co-development tools for discussing more technical aspects of stats approach, like estimates in trials, as well as animated video PPI in stats methodology, have really demonstrated how we could actually make complex concepts more accessible to a much broader audience. So why PPIE matters in early phase methods research? So there's increasing focus on patient-centered research and outcomes. Funders and regulators now expect meaningful PPIE, and particularly if you're applying for grants and in terms of your fellowships or other aspects as well. So it builds trust and transparency and relevance between researchers, patients, and the community, and ensures that our methods and outputs reflect real patient priorities as well as experiences. And speaking to a statistical audience, so what would you don't be in the space whereby you would be spending months perfecting a new statistical trial design or analytical approach, or even a simulation study, only to realize that a vital piece was missing, that you've missed the aspects of what really matters to the patients. So a lot of the things that I'm talking about actually applies to both to oncology and non-oncology trials. But today I'm going to focus more on the oncology setting. So first of all, just a quick background on what are early phase dose-finding oncology trials. So this include patients who are very much usually a very advanced stage cancer. They've exhausted standard treatment options. So this could be one of their and last few options of potential therapies. So the primary objectives of such trial is to assess the safety of the therapy. So it's particularly very first in human or if the first time there's been a particular patient population. And it's also to assess tolerability of the treatment. Is to then determine the recommended phase 2 dose. So what is the dose that will bring forward to the next phase, so typically phase 2. Now this could be the maximum tolerated dose. That's the highest dose that is safe, that can be safely given to patients, or the optimal biological dose that not only take into account the safety, but also other markers, for example, activity, and patient-reported outcomes of tolerability, also things like pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, even looking at drugs. So in this setting, we have limited sample sizes. So it could range depending on whether you're talking about dose escalation or expansion, which gives you multiple multiple cohorts of patients, but small numbers. So it could range from say around 20 to up to 200 patients, depending on the phase and how seamless it is within dose escalation to expansion or even dose optimization. I'll show you an example later on. So it uses adaptive design, so this adaptive dose escalation in very small cohorts, so typically cohorts of 2 or 3 patients. So you look at the patients' outcomes and you make decision on what's the next dose to give to the next cohort of patients. So and the typical trial designs are using rule-based design for a 3+3 design. So really cohorts of 3 patients deciding on whether it's safe and then to escalate or de-escalate or to stay at that dose level. There's been a push for more advanced statistical designs to be used in this setting because they're more efficient. They give more patients the best dose during the trial, as well as recommending the best dose to bring forward to the next phase. So such designs could be the model-assisted or the model-based design. And I'll touch a little bit about the model-based design later on in my talk. So this is an example of a dose escalation and dose optimization trial. So in this setting, we are looking at cases whereby higher doses may not necessarily be more active. So in the conventional setting whereby we're looking at chemotherapies, we do expect that as you go higher the dose, it's likely to be more effective. So you want to go as high as dose as possible and to find out what's the safest dose to give the patient. So that's why it's also been the focus on maximum tolerated dose. However, for novel cancer therapies like immunotherapies or targeted therapies or cell therapies, higher doses may not be more active. So you do not just want to find out the maximum tolerated dose. You actually want to bring forward what is an optimal biological dose. So you take into account other markers to be able to help you to decide within the tolerable dose range, what is the best dose to bring forward. Now, you can look at this for cases whereby you're having a dose escalation for dose level 1 to dose level 7. So this could start at first group cohorts of 3 patients. If it's safe, you then escalate to dose level 2 for the next cohort of 3 patients, and so on and so forth. However, at higher doses, you might need a DLT. So you can, for example, in this case, for dose level 7, you get 3 patients, you got 2 patients DLT, that dose is considered unsafe. And say for dose level 6, there was 1 out of 6. So among the tolerable dose range, you could look at other markers to help you decide what are the doses that you want to explore further. And that goes on to the randomized selection of the selected dose level. So in this example, they have selected dose level 2, 4, and 5, and actually randomized patients. So you can see the numbers are actually pretty small here. So we're looking at 30 patients, randomizing them, and then looking at just not only toxicity, which is all the signs, which is a dose-limiting toxicities outcomes, but also other markers. You're looking at totality of data here. So you'll be looking at and activity primarily, also but perhaps PK and PD to help you decide what is the best dose then to bring forward. So we're very much limited by sample sizes, but we want to make the best decision out of a very small number of patients. Okay, so now I've given you a background of dose finding trials. Now I'm going to talk a bit about my journey in involving patients and methods research. This really started off with the very first invitation that I was asked to speak to a patient event. So this is an Experimental Cancer Medicine Center, ECMC event. So that was in 2016. So I was asked to give an interactive session on implementation of a Bayesian design. So this is a model-based design I talked about earlier on. This is one of the more advanced statistical design, and that's using a continuum reassessment method. So that models dose and toxicity relationship and recommend and the next cohort of patients, giving them the dose that's closest to your target level. So I was asked to give that session, and what happened in that session was actually after the session, I was very much inspired because one of the comments given by some of the patients' partners there were, such a design seems very sensible. Why are we not using more of it? And when we presented that at that time, only about 5 to 10% of trials actually utilize such advanced designs. So it was actually really encouraging to actually hear from them that we should really be doing more of that. There's been a great push to get those designs out at that time, but because it's a lot more complex than the 3+3 designs, trialists have been very hesitant to move towards it. But it was really encouraging to hear from patient partners that they really saw the advantages of such designs and should really be implemented more often. My next experience was then when I tried to put together a proposal on extending the consult extension for dose finding trial, and that was in 2018. A senior colleague who reviewed my proposal suggested that I should involve a patient partner in developing that proposal. And that was a really new thing for me because I've never been involved in patient partners in that time. So the proposal was then presented to a group of patients, and we received strong support and enthusiasm from them. Again, very encouraging. And we then invited a patient partner to join the project team. So yes, that's the missing piece that we managed to fill in before we submitted the proposal. Then this led on to my research area to look at how to integrate patient-reported outcomes in early phase dose finding trials, which I'll talk a bit more about it, but basically it's rarely used. In 2020 to 2021, we then presented to the NCRI Consumer Forum of Patient Advocates about the idea of integrating patient-reported outcomes in this setting. Again, we received amazing support from the patient advocates, and 2 patient partners actually helped us to write a patient perspective piece that was included in that publication. So the defined project that I talked about earlier on, we'll talk more about when we actually got the grant, developed it, how that actually and created that lay summary template that was also part of the outputs from our project. And that's really very much patient designed and motivated by that. And then lastly, about integrating patient-reported outcomes in trial design, in dose escalation design, that we're not only just taking into account clinician-reported toxicities, but as well as patient-reported side effects to make better decisions. So I'm going to focus on the first research area on the defined project, and then later on I'll touch on the 2 areas about just integrating patient-reported outcomes in this setting. Okay, the first research area about the defined. So this is SPIRIT and CONSORT extension for early phase dose finding trials. Some of you might be very familiar about the SPIRIT and CONSORT for randomized trials. So that's been recently updated in 2025. So this setting is to recommend essential items that we should be reported in trial protocol. So that's SPIRIT defined and trial results for dose finding trials. So Andrew likely was involved right from the start, and he joined the Defined Executive Committee as part of our team. So our aim was to integrate patient perspective as essential stakeholders in developing this guidance, making those finding trials more patient-centered and accessible. So what were the challenges though of including patient PPIE in Define? So just to give a background that that has seldom been done in actually including patients in guideline development. And we are aware that in dose finding trials, the designs are actually even more complex. So we're expecting that, yes, and we would have not just the patient's partners actually not finding some of the technical aspects difficult, but even other multidisciplinary stakeholders might find it difficult. For example, funders coming to the meeting actually might find some of the technical aspects difficult. So it's actually really communicating to quite a big group of people. So challenges faced by Andrew was many of the technical terms and complex concepts of the finding trials were discussed in our project meetings. And actually sometimes it's very difficult for him to actually understand all the things that we're talking about in terms of the concepts and the terminology. So it's a feedback loop whereby we drafted Delphi candidate items. So these are potential items that could be included in the Spirit Consort guidance. So they're reviewed by Andrew as well as our wider patient partners representative, who highlighted the technical challenges as barriers to patient understanding of involving them in then the Delphi survey. So this is a survey whereby we'll be asking the stakeholders to rate how important some of the items are to be actually included in the protocol or trial results publication. So our solution that we came up with was to decide to only invite patient partners with expertise in early phase trials to participate in the Delphi survey, so they understand what the items and then whether they're important to be included in those two settings, trial protocols or trial results. We also then established a PPIE working group to focus on what would be useful to patients and the public in this guideline development and how best to embed the patient perspective here. So our idea that came out was actually with the patients was to actually develop a lay summary toolkit. So that's focusing more on the trial results publications, how to communicate that to the patients and the public, producing simple and clear summaries. So in terms of our toolkit development process, we reviewed existing lay summary examples and guidance. We saw lots of examples, not loads, but actually a few examples actually, but they were all, a lot of them were very long. And there's actually very limited guidance on how to actually report that to patients. So we then collaborated with the patient partners to select key items and format. How should we present that lay summary document? We piloted using a published dose finding trial to create a best practice example after we've created that template. And we refined that through expert feedback. So we've asked media and experts from media, ethics, as well as regulators on that summary toolkit. And also obtained broader PPIE input from the Newcastle group. There was a very much established patient group. So in terms of our outcomes, the future planned, the reception for the toolkit was very much well received by the experts as well as the broader PPIE groups. Our next step is to disseminate the toolkit to improve those finding trial reporting for lay audiences. And we're going to have an ongoing evaluation. So if you utilize the toolkit, please and do feedback to us about how to refine it further. So what does it look like? So this is a lay summary toolkit that it was designed by Andrew and our other patient partners. So we've got the title, headlines, and 1 to 2 sentences summarizing the key findings made out of the trial, state the dates the trial ran for, and the summary. Why was this research needed? What were the key conclusions? Who volunteered to take part in the study? And how did we deliver the trial? How was the trial done? So description of what the name of the drug, the route, the dose levels that were considered, the frequency as well as the cycle, and brief description of the mechanism of actions that appropriate, how was the safety of the participants monitored throughout. And what were the results? So really summary of what worked well, what remained unclear, and what didn't work well. So it's early phase trials, so obviously there was going to be things whereby it still remained unclear because it's a very much early phase. So what are the main challenges for the patients with the treatment in terms of side effects and quality of life? What happens next? Where can we find more information, and as well as acknowledgement? So that's the lay summary template in the whole. We then use a published phase 1 paper that was shown here on the left here, and then we wrote it in terms of the lay summary using the lay summary template, as you can see from here, and it's available in the publications, and I'll show you later on in the link there. So this is the publication that shows us. You can see here from Andrew and Richard, who actually presented this at the ICTMC conference in 2024. And this kind of summarizes, if you want more details, that the QR code is there. So it's really a much patient-designed lay summary toolkit to help present phase 1 trial results simply and concisely to the patient's partners. And to patients and the public. Okay. Next, I'm going to touch on my next research area, and that's really to integrate PROs, patient-reported outcomes, in dose-finding oncology trials. So this, in terms of this ratio, some of the publications that are shown later also covers non-oncology, but here I'm going to focus primarily on the oncology trials. Now, the conventional approach is that the clinicians will assess a patient's safety and toxicity by grading side effects using established grading guidelines. So for context, it's using the CTCAE grading, which is a conventional approach. And for the new approach, what we're thinking of is to combine both clinician-reported severe side effects as well as patient-reported experiences to get a fuller picture of the treatment impact. So the idea is to incorporate multiple outcomes. So instead of just focusing on safety, which is the conventional approach, we should be thinking about not just safety, but also preliminary efficacy. So in terms of whether, for example, in the cancer setting, whether it shrinks the tumor size, pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamics, how the drug reacts to the therapies. And besides that, there's a tolerability aspect of it. And conventionally, we're looking often at dose modification, interruption, or discontinuation. So whether a patient actually discontinued, whether their dose was interrupted or modified. However, we haven't actually very much focused on patient-reported outcomes because actually that's key outcomes to give you a fuller picture as well of tolerability. So what are patient-reported outcomes? So patient-reported outcomes are defined as any report of the status of a patient's health condition that comes directly from the patient, without interpretation of the patient's response by a clinician or anyone else. And they're regarded as gold standards for assessing subjective symptoms, quality of life, functional abilities, and overall well-being in both clinical practice and clinical trials. So they're very much used in late-phase trials, and you see that a high proportion of trials actually have a quality of life or pro outcome in their trials. However, it's not very much utilized in early phase trials. And we know that integrating pros would empower patients as well as physicians to make better decisions. So this is an example of a pro questionnaire. So for example, if you're trying to assess a pro concept, which is overall side effect impact summary, this is a question, it's just one question asking the patient to rate. So within the last 7 days, how bothered they are by the side effects of treatment. So it could be not at all the way to very much. Now, if you want to assess overall health-related quality of life, you be utilizing one of this questionnaire, which is the ERTC-KLQ C30, which is very commonly used in cancer trials. And these two questions actually gives you the overall health-related quality of life. So how would you rate your overall health during the past week? And how would you rate your overall quality of life during the past week? So there's different pro concepts that could be assessed to look at tolerability of treatment. The other aspect is obviously about symptomatic adverse events. It's asking patients to rate what the side effects that they experienced in the last week or so. So for instance, this is an example of abdominal pain. So you're asking, it's called Pro-CTCE questionnaire. You're asking the patients to rate the last 7 days, how often do you have pain in your abdomen? And how was the severity? And whether that pain actually interfere with your usual or daily activities. So the patient will be filling this in, and that could be either using paper questionnaire or using electronic pros. Now let's contrast this with what the clinicians rated. So at the bottom of the blue, you can see the clinician rated using this new version, CTCE version 6. So they rated whether that's mild pain, moderate pain, and whether that interfere with daily activity. And that's into grade 3 is about severe pain. So that's how clinicians has been rating side effects. Now, the DLT that's used throughout, so dose-limiting toxicities, generally consists of treatment-related events that are grade 3 and above. So in this case, it would be severe pain and forward. So there's still grade 4 and 5, but there are other symptoms. So treatment-related grade 3 or 4. So if a patient actually experienced any of those treatment-related adverse events, that would be deemed as a patient has experienced a dose-limiting toxicity. So it's very different, as you can see, how patients will be filling in, as well as how clinicians rating it. Now, what are the current landscapes of pros in phase 1 trials? So we looked at clinicaltrials.gov and over 10,000 trials. Pros are seldom included. In fact, only about 5% of trials actually included it. However, there was a significant increase over time from 3.2% in 2007 to 6.4% in 2020. Still very low. And when they're included, they're typically included as secondary endpoints. So we then did a global professional stakeholder survey to understand what people think about inclusion of pros in this setting. We're actually surprised that there's actually broad support of pros in dose selection. However, there are top 5 barriers that key stakeholders have. So these are professionals who are clinical trialists, so clinicians, statisticians, trial managers. We also have funders, regulators who actually completed these forms. So the top 5 barriers, the top barrier was the lack of guidance regarding pro selection. So which pro item should we be including in the questionnaire? And this is an important fact because what you include is what you will be asking, what you'll be collecting from patients. Because if you don't include a particular question, you will not get the answer from the patient. So it's very important to think about what are the key things to include. And in early phase setting, you might not actually necessarily know what the symptoms you should be capturing as well. So that's one key challenge. The other aspect is about missing pro data. So this group of patients are generally very sick, and there's a high chance of them progressing as well. So it's about what about missing pro data that could occur here, and whether that could still be helpful when you have such a large amount of missing data. Overburdening staff and patients again, well, some of the key barriers as well, and the lack of guidance regarding how do you then report pro analysis and publication in small trials, and typically non-randomized in a cancer setting. So we also then did a survey with the patient advocates via the NCRI Consumer Forum, and that was done in 2021. We introduced dose finding trials because not all patient advocates have been involved in in phase 1 trials, as we said earlier, that actually patient involvement has been quite weak in that area compared to the later phase trials. So we had to introduce the concept of dose finding trials, what typical trial designs have been used in that setting, and then we introduced patient-reported outcomes and what the key concepts that we could be considering in this setting. And then we then followed by a Zoom poll voting. And you can see from here the agreement for using PROS to inform RP2D. The patient advocates were strongly really advocating for the use of it. So this is recommending what the best dose to bring forward to the next phase. In terms of professionals, we still also get actually really quite broad agreement that it should be used, about 68%. Even though only about 5% of trials actually utilize it, there's a broad support for actually thinking of utilizing and integrating PROS in those finding trials. So why PROS matter in this setting? Now, what are the problems without them? So we know that clinician-assessed CTCAE grading may miss up to half the symptomatic adverse events versus what patient reports in terms of the side effects. Adverse effects that are difficult to observe, for example, fatigue, may be inadequately characterized if we do not include patient-reported outcomes. So that leads on to underestimating of toxicity and tolerability. So no patient perspective on what actually is tolerable, whether the dose is tolerable. So that could lead to costly delays or failures in the clinical development pathway, and also missed opportunities to intervene clinically or develop supportive measures. So this is good to see that we have increasingly a number of de-escalation trials because the dose that were recommended to move forward to the randomized phase setting. We've seen a lot of treatment discontinuation or modification, which also meant that in the earlier phase setting, that dose might not have been gotten correctly. So what's the solution? It's to incorporate PROS to better assess treatment tolerability, to identify kinder treatments earlier, and to improve patient-centered dose selection. If we get the dose selection in as best as we can in the early phase, that will really help us to make better decisions in the later phase trials. So this work is then published in this publications using PROS and dose finding trials, whereby we surveyed, as I mentioned, about the key stakeholders, the professionals, as well as the NCRI Consumer Forum. And this is a piece that's written by the late as well as Richard Stevens, and thinking about why we should be really integrating PROS in the setting. So I'll just give you a few seconds to read this. Okay. So next, I'm going to talk about integrating the patient voice in dose selection. So this is talking about when we are trying to find the recommended phase 2 dose, or even at the adaptive stages where after every small cohort of patients, how can we integrate PROS to help make better decisions? So we did a survey, a review on the published trials, and found 35 trials that has published with PRO analysis. So you can see from here that PROS are rarely considered in dose decisions, about 11%. 3 have utilized it in the final analysis to recommend what's the best dose to bring forward, so recommended phase 2 dose, and 1 has used it for both the interim and the final dose selection. However, there's been heightened interest sparked by the FDA Optimus project, as well as other international initiatives. You can see some of the papers on the right. So what the FDA said was the PROS can provide a systematic and quantitative assessment of expected symptomatic side effects and the impact on function. Inclusion of PROS should be considered to enhance the assessment of tolerability in dose-finding trials as well as subsequent trials. So let's get pros as a tolerability endpoint for dose selection. So obviously, as the concept is actually really new, it's really a novel endpoint. There is very few trial designs that's considered both clinician and patient-rated toxicity to guide dose selection. So there's a few designs that actually allowed for that. So the very first design was a pro CRM. So earlier I talked about continuous assessment method. So that's actually integrating both patient-reported as well as clinician-reported and toxicities in the CRM model to help making decision. So the type is to allow for the late effects of toxicities. In 2024, there are two further publications. I'm going to touch on the one that Emily has developed called the Utility Pro CRM, which is an extension of the Pro CRM. So in this diagram here on the left, you can see that we have often in a continuous assessment, we set a target of what is acceptable. So here, the target clinician rated DLT, so dose limiting toxicity rate at 25%. So we're saying that and we're happy to accept that 25% of patients might accept the dose limiting toxicity in exchange for the fact that actually we want to go to that level because that level might be active and could help patients in terms of shrinkage of tumor size, for example. Now, in the ProCRM, we then take into account not just the clinician DLT rate, but also an acceptable patient DLT rate. So this is on the x-axis, the patient DLT. So you can see that actually the green region, which is the region of an acceptable doses, now is then reduced further because you're taking into account not just the clinicians, but as well as the patient and target level. And what Emily did further on was really to extend that to be a utility curve here, so that it's more flexible and you can change, you can determine the shape of the utility curve based on that trade-off between patient as well as clinician-reported DLTs. So the dose of the estimated clinician DLT or the patient DLT rate that's closest to the utility curve will then be selected as the MTD. So the MTD that is basically determined both by the clinicians rated as well as patient rated DLTs. Now, this utility curve obviously could actually change in terms of the shape as well. So this shows an example. So if you were to design such a trial, as one of the stakeholders that you really have to engage very closely is definitely with the patients to about determine what is a good utility curve that is a good compromise between in terms of the trade-off between the two. So defining patient DLT. So talk about patient DLT earlier on. What is actually a patient dose-limiting toxicity? What qualifies as intolerable from the patient's perspective? For example, the persistent or bothersome symptoms that significantly impact their daily life or overall well-being. And the key considerations are about the timing. So are we looking at acute or are we looking at cumulative side effects? And as well as a threshold. So how do we align with the clinician-rated dose-limiting toxicity? There's ethical implication as well. So it's about balancing efficacy. You want to get as much activity as possible that's actually effective for the patients, but as well as the patient comfort, whether they can actually tolerate it, actually continue the treatment so that they can benefit from it. So this then led on to this work with and Emily's work about the PPIE in terms of development of innovative patient-centric early phase dose finding trials, because to answer those questions, it's really important to engage with the patient. So this is a work plan of what Emily did. So she first created a patient information sheet, so a detailed background of the event that we're hoping to do, collect patient availability, contact details, as well as the basic demographic data for the interested PPIE partners. So we then invite the patient partners and to the meeting. We confirm session details, and we also sent out some pre-readings. So we prepared some materials so that the patient partners could actually have a quick read about it to know what to expect when they come to the meeting. So Emily then did a few rounds of slide preparation. This is the very first time that she's done an engagement with patients in this work. I forgot to mention that Emily's a PhD student. This was done during her really end of her first year of her PhD. So we then, and the slides were being reviewed by not just myself, but by research nurses who are very experienced, engaging with patients as well as clinicians. So to really help her to shape the slides so that they're actually easily communicable to understand for patient partners. We then hosted the meeting, and then we then follow up as well, writing up the discussion from the meeting. We email attendees a copy of the summary, reimbursement form, as well as to invite any feedback that they might have. So in terms of patient participants, we had 9 patients who were based in the UK and Canada. The majority of the attendees were at least 65 years old, and just over half were female. All participants were white. 6 participants had participated in a clinical trial, and 4 had experience of a phase 1 trial. So we were and purposefully looking at patients who had experience of phase 1 trial as well to be included in this meeting. Most were novice or intermediate patient partner with some experience working as a patient partner. Okay, so what were the patient advocates' perspective from this work? So you can see from here, put into different categories here. First of all, let's look at the value approach. So patients, and clearly stated, it's essential to listen to a patient's viewpoint on symptoms, and frequent pill collection can help patients remember side effects between their treatments. So that's a value approach. How about the practical considerations? So some patients were saying that the questionnaire size or how long the questionnaire. So it's if you have an overwhelming number of boxes to take, that might be a problem. As well as subjectivity of it, so everyone reacts differently, and so they might fill it in differently for the questionnaires. Past illnesses, comorbidities may affect how patient then report as well. So we also talk about toxicity versus tolerability, about clinicians defining toxicity, but patients actually defined and tolerability. And there was a great suggestion by one of the patient partners about perhaps we could be asking patients if this level of toxicity would stop them taking part in the trial, so that in a way to think about what is dose limiting for that patient. It was touched on impact of PROS on dose decisions and efficacy. You can see earlier on that by integrating PROS with clinician DLTs, you might actually shrink the region of acceptable doses. And some of the patients mentioned about they are reluctant to drop out unless side effects could be life-threatening. That they also fear that lowering dose may reduce efficacy. So, for example, if we were to lower the dose, I feel that it would be a worry that it might not be as effective. And we did touch on the fact that for newer cancer therapies, this may not necessarily be the case because higher doses may not be more effective. Some patients may downplay severe symptoms because in this setting, patients, as I mentioned earlier on, they've exhausted all standard therapy, so they really want to stay on treatment. So one patient advocate said, "This is my last chance of treatment. I'm going to tolerate severe pain to keep going, to stay on the treatment." So one key takeaway, the patient perspective review PROS are vital for tolerability assessment, but also raise practical and ethical consideration in dose selection. How does that impact on Emily's actually subsequent PhD work? Even though we were aware, part of her plan was to look at pro-integrated trial designs with multiple outcomes, it really stressed further on the importance of actually integrating PROS with multiple outcomes to help make decisions to really move the field forward. So this is the patient's perspective piece that was written by one of the patients. It is actually available in the publications, and if you're interested, you could have a quick look at it as well. But some of the comments and perspective was summarized earlier on. So just to summarize, PPIE in methods research, the challenges and opportunities that we talked about. So key challenges is a unfamiliar territory. It's still very much early in its infancy, so it's less established in methods research than others fields. There's communication barriers when we talk about more complex technical concepts. They are hard to explain clearly, and so there's a challenge for us researchers to know how better to do it. And the technical content, so it's also the fact that there's indirect patient impact, which also makes engagement slightly harder in that sense. So there's also limited resources and examples. I know that's growing, but there is still very few models that has shown how we engage with patients effectively. So more will be welcome in this to help others. So what we've done so far from the examples I've given, feasibility that's demonstrated. So we have shown that it could be done for early phase methods research in terms of the defined guidance or the pro-integrated dose finding design. Effective PPIE does require planning, structure, and flexibility. For example, we talk about introductory sessions, reading materials, and to help your patients, partners to actually understand what you're expecting from them, the research setting, and what you're expecting from them to contribute to the discussion when you meet with a wider group. Safe, inclusive environments and experienced PPIE chairs could really help as well to foster trust. So why early engagement matters, it does help to shape patient-centered design decisions, as shown earlier. It can improve communication that shapes research plan. For example, the lay summary toolkit that came about through the Define project. It brings new perspectives that guide future research. It also builds confidence and really built that patient advocates champions, so patients who are very interested in helping with methods research. So I'm going to end off with some personal reflections. In being involved in some of the PPIE work has really changed my outlook in terms of how that how that can impact on the research that we do. So I now see PPI central to methodological innovation. It's not just about thinking about when you're creating a design or creating a new approach. You could think about, yes, how does that impact on patients? But actually speaking to them actually is so much more powerful. And so I encourage people to do that. So our team now aims to embed patient perspective early, not just as an afterthought. Why it matters. Method research may feel distant, as I mentioned earlier, from direct patient impact, but we must ask what truly matters to patients and how can that guide the new designs of analysis that we're trying to develop. Aligning innovation with patient value, so capturing what matters most, timely access for patients to get to treatment, quality of life, meaningful patient-relevant endpoints. So looking ahead, I think there's still so much to improve, but I sincerely am very grateful to the patient partners that I've got the privilege to work with for their inspiration, encouragement, for their patience with us, as well as collaboration. So if you ever bring me with a project or PhD idea, asking for my comments, you can probably guess one of my questions to you. So anyhow, for one key takeaway, so integrating meaningful PPIE in statistical methods can enrich research by incorporating patients' perspective, fosters innovation in trial design analysis, and guide future research towards patient-centered, impactful methods. So I'm fully convinced, and I hope you would, and I've given you some further thought to think about as well. So thank you very much for joining us in this talk. And so I just want to acknowledge my defined co-authors and funders, the key people who have really introduced me or already been with me for the pro journey. So Juliet, Emily, and Mel, the pro working groups, the NCR consumer forums that really contributed to a lot of the beginning work of the pro research, as well as my PPIE co-authors as stated here. So both for the defined projects as well as the pro work. So thank you.
Thank you, Christina. A virtual round of applause. No, that was really brilliant. As you've seen here, like I guess early phase dose finding trials do involve quite a lot of technical concepts. So it's great to hear your experiences of doing PPI in that setting and with them being so successful as well. Lots of great things there. I think that ideal lay summary toolkit really does sound great. And actually, I've got a phase 1 trial in write-up, so definitely going to be looking that up.
That's great.
Brilliant. But yeah, I'm going to open up the floor now to any questions that anyone would like to ask Christina. Do feel free. You can either put your hand up and can ask them directly, or if you want to just type them in the chat, you're also welcome to do that. Just whilst we're waiting for first question to come in, I think I'll open the floor and ask. I guess you've given us quite a few nice examples there of embedding PPIE in your trial methodology work. Now, I was wondering, maybe like from across all your sort of experiences there, what do you think is the biggest challenge or the biggest challenges for statisticians who are trying to embed PPI in their trial methodology work in general?
Yeah, I think the challenge is probably lack of training for statisticians, because it's not something that we are trained in, isn't it? So we don't get trained in our degrees or even when we're doing our PhD. And because it's still quite new, and people are a bit fearful of that. So I guess that's a barrier to cross. But with more examples and with more examples of people have really been doing it and actually showing the value of that as well, I think it could convince other people to actually have a try at it. So like, for example, like, even with my PhD students, I greatly encourage them to do it. And I mean, obviously there is going to be, it's more work. Like, at the beginning, you have to prepare your slides and you have to think about, how do you make it simple enough, but yet including the essential things that you need to convey to the audience. So it is a different level. So, but for statisticians, we simply, I mean, if you're for applied statistician, whereby you are used to communicate to a multidisciplinary audience, so like clinicians, trial managers, it's actually about taking on a different level, right? But if you have that training already, I think it's just going to another different level, but still building on the skill sets that you have. So I think it's just more training and more experience and more kind of like practiced. It makes it better, isn't it?
Definitely. No, yeah, I completely agree there. So I can't see any other questions come in the chat yet. Oh, yeah, I've just seen one come in now. So someone's said it makes me wonder if there are any tools out there for explaining some of the complex concepts, even if they're designed for students, that could be adapted to use with patient partners. So thinking of anything from infographics to online modules or videos, or even concise plain language glossaries. Yeah, I don't know whether you've thought about that, whether you have any materials that you use for teaching that you can, I guess, recycle.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think different people have done bits and pieces of that. I think there's no consensus, like no kind of like collated library of things that people could look at, isn't it? So I know that I think Susie, you've done something on the Estiman's work, isn't it? I know some people have done that on adaptive designs in general. They're trying to communicate that concepts of adaptive designs or platform trials. Um, I think it's just so many different things that we could do better. And I guess perhaps actually having a library whereby, those are the tools that everybody can look at. So if you're interested in estimates, look at this, adaptive design can look at this. And you're interested in like for example, let me think about uh, uh, adaptive design early phase trials, that's different settings as well. There's so many different adaptive designs. Yeah, I think that would be really helpful, collation of that library. So maybe Laura has already had that thought.
Yeah, go ahead, Laura.
Well, I guess we hope that people would share things on the LinkedIn community of practice site. So there's a good place to look. But I just wanted to comment because in my experience, when we've developed resources for public contributors, I've then started to use them in my teaching. It's sort of gone the other way round. So we developed a glossary, and actually one of our MSc students said, you should give this out on day one of the MSc in medical statistics. It would be so useful. So actually the PPI resources and Susie's Estiman tool I use in my clinical trials week teaching. So I think these things are useful for everyone,
Yes.
not just for patients. So I think they have, lots of uses. Once you've developed something, I found the resources that we've developed to be useful in lots of situations. So yeah.
Yes, I fully agree with that actually. Because I think a lot of times the tools that you develop for even for conditions, right? Different that I think to understand those can be utilized like, to actually maybe make it like, reduce the technical kind of certain terms, but that can be utilized for patient partners too. And I think we need a lot more of it. So I mean I get the same thing from clinicians, like, how do you explain multiplicity, and when do you do it, how to avoid making mistakes on that. But I think actually if you're able to explain it well to the clinicians, which is different stakeholders, and actually then thinking about whether that is sufficient as well for just the general public would be very helpful. And I think statisticians need to do better at that. We probably need to really build our communication power or whatever.
It's a great opportunity for us definitely to do that. Agree. Yeah. Brilliant. And so hearing you sort of, touch on sort of, I guess there's some resources out there for adaptive and Bayesian methods. I guess these methods are becoming more prominent now. I wondered, obviously they're sort of more complex trials. I don't know whether you have more insight there through your experience on how the role of PPI might evolve and help guide decisions in developing decision criteria in such trials.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of scope for actually really involving patient partners and that. So, for example, in Emily's work on integrating pros in dose finding trials, whereby she's thinking about what would be considered a patient dose limiting toxicity. So, knowing what that level, first of all, knowing what defines patient reported DLTs would be very important, and that obviously needs to include patients, and then to set that level that is acceptable for patients, because that actually then gets integrated into the design is actually quite crucial as well. So involving that will be important. And then and for Bayesian designs, there is some prior kind of that you need information. So before you actually see any data, what is the expected rate or estimates that you have, or whether we don't know anything about it. That would be really helpful as well to get patients' perspective into it as well. And in terms of adaptive design, so when is the time point, like, that is most meaningful for patients to assess effects so I think there's so much actually. And we often do not include patient partners in that because obviously very technical. We often design trials with the trials team, and that typically includes the clinical investigators. But I see that actually the patient partners have actually an important role. Obviously, they need a bit of training as well to get to the level where they understand the design, their perspective might actually impact on the design as well. But I see a lot of work could be in that space to really help us to get better patient-centered kind of adaptive designs, and very crucial, particularly because some of the decisions will impact the ongoing aspects of the trial, because obviously in adaptive designs means that there could be several interim analysis that could impact how the trial then adapt across the journey.
Very much. And it's encouraging to sort of hear like the support you had from public partners that we should be using like the more complex dose finding studies and model-based ones. I'm sure like with speaking to patients, like adaptive trials have so many benefits for them and Bayesian that actually it will give us more for doing more of these trials once the funders see that the patients really love these trials more as well. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, no, it's really encouraging. I think so. So I wish I had talked to them earlier on, because I think when I first did the very first kind of like conjugate system method, it was a really hard push to convince the trials community to attempt at it, even though I'm very convinced, like through all the the literature and through my simulations, that it's so much better for patients, right? Not only just within the trial, but also getting the right dose. And yeah, so I concentrated so much effort on convincing the trial community. But then when I just had a talk with the patient partners, like, wow, it's just such a big difference in terms of how open and how encouraging it is from them. Like, this is so I don't know what the questions was, why isn't this done earlier? Like, why are people not doing it? So it was really, yeah, it's really great. So it's almost the same talk, but actually you get very different responses. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Can't see any more questions in the chat. I don't know whether any have sprung to mind for anyone whilst we've been chatting. Oh, yeah. Imma, I can see you've got your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Christina, for the very helpful talk. And I've learned quite a lot about it. So I was wondering, like, if you have any sort of issues previously of maybe like patients who do not really like they don't participate much in these patient-reported outcomes, and will you see that as a problem, or is that something that's not necessarily an issue with those finding trials?
Do you mean that if you ask the patients to complete the pro questionnaire, they might not want to complete it? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, like low participation rate in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, yes, that could obviously happen. But I think one of the main important things that I mean many other authors have actually mentioned is about letting the patients know what you are going to use for the patient. So very clearly how relevant it is, like for the research, and how that it might help to move the field or to answer the trial questions. And if patients are very aware of what it is, and how helpful it might be, then they'll be more willing to participate. However, I guess there's always going to be a pool of patients who might not want to complete. And in most trials, there will be a rate whereby you don't get any baseline pros at all, and you don't get any subsequent ones. But I haven't seen most of the trials that rate seems to be fairly low. So I guess it's very important for us researchers to be able to communicate very clearly to patients why we're collecting the endpoint and how that might impact on like the trial decisions. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I might just ask one last question. Maybe, I guess, reflecting on all of it together, or everything together, what would you say has been like your biggest positive or like biggest key learning from working with patients and publics on your projects?
I think they have really helped me to see a different perspective that I did not expect. And sometimes you can go into a meeting whereby you have thought about, I think the patients will probably say this and the clinician will say this, that kind of thing. But I think one of the things that I really felt it was, they helped me to see things from a different perspective, or that they actually confirmed what I thought what I thought means most to them, and it's really helped me to shape my research, I think, further to be more focused as well, but also to actually realize that, like, the research that we do, sometimes lots of simulations, which I typically do, actually does mean, like, does help us to actually really find a design or a method that would really help the patients. So I think that's probably one key in a in a roundabout way of how it has really helped me. And so I would think that even though there's lots of preparations required, and I've seen like the patient partners more as really a very close collaborator that could help me see a different perspective that I normally wouldn't see.
No, that's great. And I really sort of, associate with that as well. And hopefully that's inspiring for others as well. Thank you. Thank you, Christina, for your great talk today and answering questions there. So talk's been recorded, so we will share it on our YouTube channel. And I guess you can go there for previous talks as well. And just before we end, just want to sort of remind everyone of our next seminar. So our next seminar is going to be on Tuesday, the 25th of November. So that's at 10:30. And that's going to be given by Ruth Walker. She's a research fellow from the University of York. And she's going to be talking about evidence synthesis methods for overcoming data scarcity in child health. And she'll be sharing her experiences of involving children and their families there. So do join us again from that. But just to end today's session, thank Christina once again, and thank you all for listening. Thanks, Christina.